The final part of our learning series is going to take what you've done to plan for your school's approach to accelerated learning in terms of identifying priorities, selecting acceleration strategies, communicating to families. And we're going to take all of that and walk through how those plans are then implemented and applied to individual students. This particular video looks at some of the questions that need to be answered in order to have implementation of accelerated learning that is truly focused on putting the needs of our most diverse learners at the forefront. So first, we're going to look at what systems need to exist for successful implementation. There are a bunch of questions that we need to look at as we think through what systems need to exist. So for example, are your strategies being used as tier 1 approaches, i.e. they're being used for all students, or are they being used for higher tier interventions? That would mean students who need additional supports for whom the tier 1 approaches are not have not been successful. This is really important because you need to understand who needs to know how to do these approaches and what kinds of planning do you need in order to make them successfully implemented. Along the same lines, you also need to know what other cultural or universal supports will you need to implement. So these are the tier 1 approaches. What other tier 1 approaches will you need to implement that you have not implemented already? Many schools before COVID actually struggled tremendously with the tier 1 approaches. Things like equitable and supportive classroom management techniques, creating a culture of collaboration, and using a strong research-based curriculum are some examples. These things are going to be essential now. If you need to be able to not only focus on learning, but accelerate that learning, your tier 1 strategies and your universal supports are going to have to be spot on. Next, we have to look at how does data collection and analysis get implemented in an ongoing and timely manner. So this is important for recognizing what you're doing that is successful, but it's also important because you want to be able to quickly identify when things aren't working and adjust and change course as quick as possible so that you can implement something that is going to be able to work. How to get your staff up to speed and avoid initiative overload is another critical systemic question that you need to answer. Our staff has been working tirelessly in circumstances that they've never seen before, and they're worn out. Going back to the same approach of piling initiative upon initiative upon initiative is going to burn people out. And so it's really important that you recognize in your planning that staff are working, their cognitive load and their cognitive ability may not be what it was before. And yet we are now going to be asking them to shift course again and provide a whole new set of supports. How to create time for this work in the master schedule. So the master schedule is sort of the key to all of this, right? How are you going to make sure that staff have the time to collaborate with each other? How are you going to make sure that professional development is appropriately planned and supported throughout the day? How are you going to make sure that coaching and classroom observations are happening? There is a lot to do, and the master schedule sort of holds the keys to being able to do that in a way that is going to support folks through this work. And finally, what other types of wellness supports do we need to implement for staff, students, and families? We've mentioned this before, but it's really important to think about how are we going to support our communities to rally together in this recovery work. Families are tired. They basically had to take on the role of teacher in a year where they were also learning how to do their own jobs from home. Students have had to be learning online and learning in ways that they'd not previously accessed before. And staff, again, they had to do things totally differently this year. So, how are we going to offer wellness supports in our schools so that we're supporting everybody through this process? You may want to consider doing things like offering stipends for taking on new work, or other types of recognition for the work that adults are doing to support their students. All right, now that we've zoomed out to look at the systemic questions, we also need to look at what the experience looks like for the individual student, the sort of zoom in approach. And again, we have some key questions that need to be answered. How are we going to communicate and partner with our families in this work? This has been an overarching theme through many of our discussions, but it's really critical that we are working with families to design instructional approaches that work for their kids. Um, this means communication is a two-way street. This means hearing from them as well as telling them what's going on. And it might mean telling them what you don't know. It is okay to say you have not answered a question yet, but then it's also important to make sure that you go and answer it and follow up with folks. How are students going to be engaged in the planning process? Their voices are important. They've had a hard time this year too, and it's important that we look to them to think through what kind of plans need to happen in order to recover the entire school community. Again, at the individual student level, we also have to look at the role of data collection and review for implementation and progress monitoring. We gather so much rich information about students, especially our students with disabilities. It's just built into how we do compliance. And yet we often don't use the majority of that data. And so thinking through how we're going to make sure that we are collecting and reviewing that data on an ongoing basis and using that to make better decisions for recovery is essential. How do we ensure that all adults are empowering students in this process? So similar to having students be engaged in this planning process, we also have to have or ensure that students are empowered for their own goals and really feeling like they're part of this solution to making their school communities a more supportive environment and also to reaching their own learning goals in the process. And finally, what is the role of the IEP in this work? Are we maintaining the least restrictive environment for each child? This is, again, both a sort of macro question and a micro question, in that we need to make sure that we are honoring the legal requirements that we have to give to students with disabilities in ways that are not going to penalize the students and the families. This is up to us to make sure that we give them what they deserve and what they are entitled to, and do it in a way that is not going to overly restrict them or single them out into environments where they don't get to be with their peers for the majority of the time.